Welcome, and it's a huge pleasure to have with us tonight Don Walker, who is one of three, I think, at MOLA, dealing really with osteology and the analysis and understanding of bones and much else. So we'll come to that, but it's incredibly impressive in terms of the number of sites you've dealt with over time, one of which has interfaced with our own work at the Charter House, where we did a project between, I think, 2012 and 17 called Revealing the Charter House. And so know a little bit about that extraordinary institution, but I know you are dealing with the aspect there of discoveries that you undertook alongside the Crossrail project. So, and thank you very much for bringing two skeletons, which everyone can have a little kind of further understanding of, and all the implications from another of our sites at 50 Fenchurch, I think, both of them. So that's work you're doing now. But reading the report on the Charter House reveals the extraordinary amount one can actually gather about the culture of time and people through burials and bones. But just in reverse, I think I'm doing the right thing here. Yeah, I think it's interesting to look at it in reverse as well. You know, this is George Stubbs's Whistle Jacket, and it's a beautiful representation of this great horse that had raced with its coat, tail, fantastic tail, wonderful pride. One thinks of also the kinetic. So I think, you know, the stillness of these burials is one thing, but one has to look beyond that somehow to the interpretation of the kinetic world. And if one thinks about how difficult it is to understand that movement, you only have to think back to Leonardo's great battle scenes with horses and people. The sophistication of movement is like a dance. I think then we get to Muybridge and locomotion. You begin to understand how a skeleton relates to this movement and to the particular beast. Stubbs did a set of wonderful comparative and anatomical drawings, which I think are remarkable. And just thinking, this is actually a very famous horse called Eclipse, hence the Eclipse Stakes and part of that trajectory of the thoroughbred. But you just begin to get a sort of sense of the way that the skeleton, the bones of the legs, the pelvis, and that structure is there just to house muscle, you know, and in order to enable that movement. I mean, you know, forget Formula One. This is sophistication beyond one's imagination. But it just brings me back to this sense of what can be gleaned in reverse, or whichever way you look at it, through the understanding of bones and fragments. So, Don, without further ado, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for inviting me tonight. I just want to start off just to remind me to advise you that there will be a few images of human skeletal remains in this presentation. So if you really don't want to see them, please feel free to vacate for half an hour or so. So I should start by saying a little about myself. I did my undergraduate degree in archaeology with a focus on prehistory. and then I did a master's in osteology, followed by, I basically went off to work abroad, went to Italy, where I converted to medieval archaeology and excavated a church, and then went to work at Santa Maria della Scala in Siena here, where I excavated the city cemetery, and that's my first brush with the Black Death. Then I saw this book on the right here. This is the first MOLA, Museum of London Archaeology monograph, and I happened to see it when I was working out in Italy, and I read it and I was so impressed that I actually wanted to work for the company. It sounds a bit cheesy, but I was really into the medieval archaeology, and this really impressed me. And so I applied to join MOLA, and I managed to get in. And after a few years, I managed to get into the team that were studying the burials from St Mary's Spital. There were quite a few, there were 10,000 there. St Mary's Spital is, if you don't know, it's by Spitalfields Market. Anyway, I ended up working with the team on the skeletons and contributing to the 60th MOLA monograph. Okay, this is perhaps the only surviving bit of St Mary's Spital that's left. It's the cemetery chapel, 14th century, and it's now actually preserved beneath Bishop Square behind glass, so you can go and see it. In the background is the western half of Spitalfields Market, the Victorian Market, and that western half was taken down as part of the development. And this is just to show you a reconstruction of St Mary's Spital. The cemetery chapel is just down here in the midst of the cemetery, and then we have the main buildings up here, the tower, the chancel and the transepts where the patients were probably kept, and then we have the road, let's see if this works, the road here leading out of London going north from Bishopsgate. Basically, it was outside the main city centre, so it was not so crowded, a good place for a hospital, but at the same time, it was the main road going to London, so it could attract the custom of pilgrims. And part of the reason for establishing the priory was to look after pilgrims as they passed through to London and to Canterbury. Okay, just as the Spitalfields project was ending, Crossrail was starting up, and obviously people know a lot about Crossrail, but just briefly to say that our involvement started pretty early on, prior to 2010, and it's the construction for the Elizabeth line through the centre of London. We had a number of sites right in the centre, and one of them was Charterhouse. I'd always wanted to see what was behind the walls of Charterhouse, and I finally got a chance when they organised the community excavation there, and also when they opened up the museum as part of the opening up of the whole edifice in, I think, 2017 to the public. Now, just to set it in context, the area where Charterhouse is now, the site which we were working on for Crossrail was in Charterhouse Square here and a bit to the south here, and the Charterhouse buildings are just up here presently. And this is basically the site, the Crossrail site, put onto the area of West Smithfield, but during the medieval period. The archaeological site itself was open for quite some time in 2012, 2013. You'll see from the map that basically the whole area was dominated by religious houses. There was Bartholomew's to the south, and then St John Clerkenwell and St Mary Clerkenwell to the north. And actually there wasn't an awful lot of archaeology between them, probably because of the control of the religious houses in the area. So there's a bit of quarrying and some dumping of waste, and that was about it really. And basically all this changed in the mid-14th century with the Black Death. And that's when Sir Walter Manny, who was a courtier of Edward III, leased 14 acres of land from St Bartholomew's to open up a cemetery. And this was specifically for the Black Death. He opened it up in either late 1348 or early 1349. And basically, it joined another cemetery that had just been opened to the north of Charterhouse. It was about 500 metres to the north, so along the Clerkenwell Road, basically. That was called the Pardon Churchyard, and Sir Walter Manny leased land from Bartholomew's in an area called Spittlecroft. And then these two cemeteries together became known as New Church Hall, and eventually as West Smithfield. West Smithfield basically to distinguish it from East Smithfield, because East Smithfield was another Black Death burial ground that was located over by the Tower of London. Anyway, this is just a reconstruction of the cemetery when it's in use. This is the view you'd have from the area of the Charterhouse, looking past the burial ground south with the wall of St Bartholomew's in the background, St Bartholomew's the Great behind it, and then behind that the tower of Gothic St Paul's. Okay, so there was a cemetery there, but there wasn't any Charterhouse there as yet. That didn't happen until 1371, and this is a reconstruction of Charterhouse in the 16th century, and it shows the location of the buildings, the gatehouse, the wall, and also we have in pink the archaeological area that we were investigating during Crossrail. About 100 years later, they opened their own cemetery chapel right in the middle of the burial ground. And a few people have looked for this cemetery chapel, but they haven't found it. And so we still don't know exactly where it is. Okay, this is again just shown in pink the archaeological site that we were working on. And then you might be able to see the stippled area in blue around here. This is where it's basically the conjectured area of where we think the burials were in this Black Death burial ground. And it basically stops pretty much just north of Charterhouse Square and then ends actually before the end of the square here. And there have been some previous investigations. 1998, a burial was found up here and then another burial here. And occasional bones have been brought up around the edges of the square. But what we're going to focus on in a minute is this investigation here in the southwest corner of the square, the grout shaft, which was opened up during Crossrail. This is just a map, the first real view we have of Charterhouse. It's Tudor, so many of the buildings, monastic buildings, were demolished and there was a Tudor manor house replacing it. We have the cemetery chapel there, clear as day, but we still can't find it. Yeah, it just shows the general area with some Bartholomew's down here, and the main walls of the town were over in this area here. And if you notice just even though this is quite an old map, just the shape here of the square doesn't change that much. This is 1872 map of the area. You can still just about see the same shape of the square. And this basically shows how things, sometimes they don't really change. And also, it's like a little oasis in the middle of this busy area, which has sort of remained mostly untouched. And that's great for archaeologists because, so much of London is basemented or has buildings in it, and you lose a lot of the evidence. So to get an area like this of almost sort of like virgin land is quite exciting. And this was the chance we had to investigate the Black Death Cemetery. This is the grout shaft, and if you were there when it was opened and you went up and took a look over the top, if you were lucky, you'd see some archaeologists, and if you were really lucky, you'd see some burials. And here we have the first phase of burials, 11 individuals, all laid out in a typical medieval fashion, quite carefully arranged, all orientated the same way. No sign of any rush or anything, but you are looking straight down here at the Black Death. It may be that this was a less busy time of the epidemic, or it may be that this was an outer area of the cemetery where there was less density of burial. But when you generally get a plague cemetery, you expect to find big mass pits because you have a lot of people dying, a lot of mortality. You need to get the people below the ground as quickly as possible, and you can dig individual graves, but that's quite slow. If you dig one big pit, you can fit a lot of people in at one time. So it's a reflection of how rushed they were. But actually, we do believe that actually these cemeteries were quite well planned. They were quite aware that the Black Death was coming in 1348, and the daughter of Edward III, Princess Joan, she actually died of the plague in France on her way to marry Peter of Castile. So they did some preparation before it arrived. They knew it was coming. Okay, so this is just a schematic of the Black Death over here. This is the Black Death phase. This is the first phase of use of the burial ground. What we weren't expecting so much was to see later phases. We had a second phase and a third phase. The second phase, the burials were aligned in the same way. There's only 2 of them, and we suspect that it wasn't that long after the first phase. There was no real difference in the radiocarbon dates, so we suspect that this was either perhaps towards the end of the Black Death, 1350, 1351, or possibly the second major outbreak of the disease in London, which was the Pestis Secunda in 1361. Even more surprising, we had a third phase over here, and you'll see the difference in orientation. Basically, the heads were this end, the feet were this end, and it was due east-west this time. And obviously, this is associated with sort of Christian burial rites. So they adjusted the orientation of the burials, and also the radiocarbon date suggested that this was much later, perhaps 50 to 100 years later. So it shows that they continued to use this burial ground. And the interesting thing is that we tested these individuals for plague DNA, and we found that every phase in red, which is a little red dot here, every phase contained individuals who were pathogen positive for plague. So if you've got a cemetery used for plague burials, why not continue using it for plague burials? So that makes perfect sense. So we had 11 in this phase, 2 individuals in this phase, and another 12, probably early or mid 15th century. This is again just a schematic showing you the change in orientation and showing you the individuals who are plague positive. Okay, just to give you an idea of some of the things we find in medieval skeletons when we take a very close look at them during our analysis. Over on this side, we have the maxilla, the upper jaw of an individual aged between 18 and 25 years of age. And this is a good example of the kinds of dental disease you can see. Here we have quite severe calculus, deposits of calculus or tartar that's hardened on the teeth because they didn't have the opportunity to maintain dental hygiene the way we do today. So they were more vulnerable to build up of calculus. And over here and up here especially, we have large carious lesions. So basically large cavities in the teeth. Eventually this would have destroyed the whole crown and the tooth would have been lost and the gum would have healed over. Over on this side, we have another individual, a male individual who died between the ages of 26 and 35 approximately. And you might be able to see the molar teeth are very, very worn down. And this is because the bread that people ate in medieval period, often it had little bits of grit in it from the millstone that was incorporated into the bread. So these tiny little bits would eventually grind down the teeth of the individuals. And those cusps you can feel at the back of your mouth would be worn flat. I'm just showing this one also because it's got a big hole here. That's a periapical lesion, a form of dental abscess, very, very chronic, and it's the size of a bucket basically. So it's huge and it would have been there for a very, very long time. It's basically to allow the pus from the infection to escape out of the bone. Another thing we see quite a lot in medieval skeletons are schmalz nodes, and these are herniations in the intervertebral discs of the spine. And we often see these usually in older individuals through wear and tear. We're not really designed to stand upright still. We're still supposed to be crawling about on four legs, but that's why our backs suffer so much. But in medieval skeletons, you often find these lesions in quite young people in their 20s or even earlier sometimes. And this is a sign probably of quite hard labour, either carrying heavy weights or carrying out a lot of activity. So it's a sign of people who perhaps weren't the wealthiest, perhaps the lower society, people who had to labour for a living. And at Charterhouse, the documents suggest that it was a burial ground for the poorer people, and certainly we can see that in the schmalz nodes because over 50% of the individuals suffered from these. Something else we see in the bone is trauma, of course. And just a couple of quick examples here. This bone here is a left first metacarpal, so it's this bone here. And this is quite normal, perfectly healthy. This one here is the right one, and here's another angle view of it. It's basically been completely smashed and crushed, possibly in an accident or possibly deliberate. We can't always tell the mechanism, but it's healed up nicely, so they survived the injury. It just would have affected the way they used their hand, obviously. Over here, we have two ulnar bones. The ulnar bone is the one on the inside of the two paired forearm bones. And this is very typical of the medieval period. We have little fractures here and here in what we call the distal shaft of the bone. And these fractures are the most common long bone fracture we see in medieval London. And yet they practically disappear by the 19th century. So something is going on in that period. Some people say that it's because people are falling over onto their hands and breaking their ulnar bone, but I don't believe people stopped falling over in the 19th century. Other people that might sometimes perhaps see some sort of craft or some sort of labouring that put strain on the lower arms might have forced the weakened bone to crack if you didn't have strong bones. Alternatively, it's often called a Parry fracture because you have your ulnar bone here, and if someone comes at you with a medieval stick and they're going to attack your head, then you put your arm up like that and they hit your arm there. So we find quite a bit of this in St Mary's Spital, and also we had two cases of this at Charterhouse Square. 2 out of 25, so that's 25 individuals. So that's quite a high prevalence rate. And both are healed. Both are perfectly healed. They align quite well because they're naturally aligned with the radius bone that's in there, so that in a way they're sort of splintered naturally by the radius that's there. Okay, also now in our toolkit over the last 10, 15 years are biomolecular methods of study. And this is obviously very exciting. We had a lot of progress in DNA work, and this is reflected in the archaeology we do as well, because we can use DNA for studying ancestry and disease and family connections and that sort of thing. And we also have isotope work. Now, the thing about isotope work is that we can look at a tooth. We know how they develop over time as you grow. We know how each tooth grows, when each root develops, when each part of a crown develops. So if you look into a child's mouth, you can tell what age they are quite easily by seeing which teeth have erupted. By the same token, we can age skeletons, child skeletons, by looking at the teeth, how they developed, how the teeth are growing. And the great thing about that is that if you take a tooth from an adult, then you know at what age roughly each bit of that tooth grew. So if you take a long cross section of that tooth, then you have information from different periods of the individual's childhood. And this means we can look at certain markers, certain isotopes that show us evidence of what was going on in their childhood. For example, we can look at strontium isotopes, which reflect the geology on which you're brought up. The geology is the signature, the strontium signature in the geology gets into the soil, that gets into the vegetation, that gets into the livestock that feed on it, or the humans that feed on it, and then if we eat the livestock, it gets into us as well. So it's quite a neat way of seeing where someone may have been brought up. And it won't tell you exactly where they're brought up, because geology is a funny thing. It doesn't occur in neat pockets. You can't say someone was born in Doncaster or something, but it can tell you if someone's brought up on chalkland or granite or in London clay. So you could say if someone's not brought up on London clay, then they weren't brought up in London or certain parts of London. So anyway, it's a very useful tool if you use strontium isotopes to track that. Also, because we know the age at which the tooth develops, if there's a change in that section, that longitudinal section, then we can say what age they may have migrated to a new area with a different geology. So it's really very useful for us. Also, we could do the same thing with carbon and nitrogen isotopes, and they reflect the diet that someone was eating. So C3 plants, C4 plants, they could all be measured in the carbon footprint of the isotope footprint. And also nitrogen isotopes can tell you what kind of protein someone was eating. And all this can be combined with the study of the skeleton, the macroscopic study and microscopic study of the skeleton, to form what we call almost an osteobiography of an individual. So this individual here that you can see, the site code for the grout shaft was XTE12, and the unique number for the individual was 159. And then we can say that they were a male individual, raised on the chalkland of eastern England. They suffered an episode of stress between about 2 to 4 years of age, possibly a disease or nutrition problems. They suffered from severe Schwarz nodes. They moved to London at about 16 years of age. They had a dietary shift at about 21 years of age with an increased marine protein element. They were exposed to Yersinia pestis, the bug that causes plague, and they died between 18 and 25 years of age, either at the end of Black Death or perhaps during the pestis secunda. So that's quite a lot of information for someone who we don't know their name and they lived 600 years ago. And a lot of that is provided purely by the biomolecular work being combined with the skeletal study. Okay, just briefly, the Black Death, the most serious pandemic to strike Europe and Britain, came up, I think it's quite well known, it came from the east, came up through the trading routes through Italy, and eventually came up to Britain in 1348, maybe in the late summer or in the autumn, perhaps through Weymouth, and then spread to London by the end of 1348. And again, just briefly, the rats, of course, famous for causing plague. The fleas that were on the rats, they basically they would be on the rat, feeding on it. They would spread plague from rat to rat, and that's fine. They can keep spreading it to the rats, but of course the rats might start dying. And then if you get too many rats dying, then the fleas go, well, I'm running out of rats here. I've got to jump ship. And we may not be their favourite, but if there's a passing human, they might leap onto them. And that's how it gets to us. They'll bite us, and then the bacteria will run up into the lymphatic system to the groin or the neck or under the arm. It will get into a lymph node and start multiplying, and then you get that big bubo under the skin, which eventually turns black, one of the reasons why it eventually became known as the Black Death. And then you start to show symptoms, and then you may die within the week, basically. That's not the, that's the bubonic form of the disease. There are two other manifestations. If it gets into your bloodstream, then you'll get necrosis occurring in your extremities, like your nose, your fingers, your toes, they'll turn black. Again, another reason why it's probably called the Black Death. And whereas the bubonic plague would kill about 70% of people who are untreated, septicemic plague will kill pretty much anyone. And the same is true of the third type, which is pneumonic plague. That's when it gets in the lungs. And that's the only form that can be spread human to human by droplet infection, as you spread a cold or flu, something like that. So that's sometimes responsible for the more rapid spread through a population. Although recently there's been a lot of research into human body lice, and it's now thought that actually they may have been responsible to a degree for the rapid body-to-body or person-to-person spread during the Black Death. And it's an ancient disease, back to the Bronze Age. I think it's the latest, the earliest it's been found. But it's still around, and occasionally you get headlines. Madagascar, Peru, certain areas of Africa, and the southwest United States, the more arid regions. And so you get information sheets from the World Health Organization. This is something from the CDC, Centre for Disease Control, when to talk to your doctor. I say fairly quickly, if you do catch plague. And you get all kinds of, it's not just rats, you get all kinds of critters like this cute ground squirrel who can pass the plague on to you. But it's not really a huge concern these days compared to some other diseases, probably because of evolutionary changes, lifestyle changes, housing changes. We tend to be more hygienic perhaps, and also of course we have antibiotics. So they can deal with plague now. As long as you're treated early, you'll usually survive. And that's in contrast, of course, to some of the very serious diseases we have today, emerging diseases that we don't have the treatments anymore because our resistance to them and the antibiotics don't work anymore, and you get a very bad reaction in some hospital infections, of course, sadly. Some of these are just known as modern diseases, E. coli especially, and some are more ancient, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. That's seeing a rise in incidence, and also things such as gonorrhea, another old disease that's basically rising at the moment. So these are the ones that people are more concerned about rather than plague these days. Okay, you may wonder why I haven't shown you a skeleton with lesions of plague, and that's because plague is an acute disease, and it's a bit like flu. You get it, and then it resolves very, very quickly over a few days. It can resolve in two ways: either you survive or you die, and that's it. There's not enough time for the skeleton to react. You get soft tissue changes, but bone needs time to remodel. And that means that we only usually see the chronic infections like tuberculosis or syphilis. We don't see plague. All this changed to a degree thanks to this famous paper from 2011, where they finally managed to sequence the full genome of a skeleton from the Black Death. This was from East Smithfield by the Tower, the other plague cemetery. And this began proving what people thought all along, that basically the Black Death was caused by plague, Yersinia pestis, because there were other ideas about what diseases may have been responsible for the mass deaths in the medieval period. So basically now with the DNA, you can drill into the pulp cavity here, you can take a scraping, and the blood rushes in and out of there during life, and it leaves traces of DNA, and that's what they use to look for pathogen DNA in these skeletons. And this is another Crossrail site down the road from Charterhouse. This is outside Liverpool Street Station, and this is the new churchyard, also known as the Bedlam Burial Ground, because it was in the backyard of the St Mary Bethlehem, the first location of Bethlehem. And basically we had, right at the end of the dig, we were looking for plague burials. Pepys had reported that plague burials were in this new churchyard. And right at the end, we did find a mass burial pit containing a minimum number of 42 individuals. The pit was truncated, so it may have been up to 100 or more, we don't know, but they were really well preserved and we could get a good date for them. So we know that they're the first half of the 17th century, still part of the second pandemic, the same as the Black Death, but a bit later. And we could send off some of these samples to the Max Planck and they could sequence the DNA from these. And they found some of the best preserved plague DNA that has been found to date. And that meant they could combine that information with other sites because they'd gone around Europe trying to identify very well dated sites that were used for the Black Death or for other plague outbreaks during the second pandemic between the mid 14th century and the early 18th century. And so they took all of these sites, looked at the evolution of the disease, how the disease changed over time, and how the host pathogen relationship might have changed. And that allowed them to work out a kind of family tree by date of how the disease changed over time and where it occurred. And from this, they could map the spread of the disease into Europe in the 14th century. There was a theory that it came in waves. Every few years it came in waves from the east and then a new infection broke out. But what actually happened was that there was a single introduction of plague into Europe in the 14th century, and then that lineage remained in a reservoir population of rodents, and every time someone got too close to them, then a new outbreak would occur. And then during the Black Death, it came back over through Russia and back to the east, and eventually part of the branch that caused the Black Death contributed eventually to the third pandemic that came out of Hong Kong, China in the early 19th century. The specific lineage that caused the Black Death itself is probably extinct though. Okay, one final thing to say is that Nick Elston is here somewhere. Yeah, there you are. He did an amazing job organising all the Crossrail work at Liverpool Street and at Charterhouse, and it couldn't have happened without him. And it's great that he's here tonight. And just to embarrass him, he's up here, and I think I'm over there somewhere. This is the community dig, which was great fun. We I think we were looking for the cemetery chapel again, weren't we? Didn't find it. But it was good to have people along to see what we'd found before and also to carry out some excavations. So I think I'll end it there. Thank you.
So I think that's absolutely thrilling. The silence was also very telling, I think, as everyone was so absorbed. But I'm sure out of that there are some questions. So can we open it to the floor?
Where the soil depletes now and we have worse soil conditions, will it be harder to do these same sort of investigations into bodies in future? So we won't be able to, I don't know, discover as much about a person as we once did.
When the soil depletes?
Yeah, because the children nowadays aren't getting enough nutrients from our soil. So I guess that will then change how you what you find out about a person, I guess.
I suppose it might do. It might change the signature that they get in their bones. So I think scientists may well have to adapt. And the boffins are always checking and cross-checking their results. And there's a lot still to understand about isotope work, for example. So I think that is something that will definitely be a factor in the future. Yeah. But I'm not a specialist, so
yeah, it's just interesting how much you can find out about a person from just their teeth, for instance, on the soil.
Yes, yeah. Yes, it is amazing, especially when they change location. To have that information about migration is quite something. And so it's not a perfect world, but it's really helpful for us, and it helps us in our interpretation of a burial population. Yeah.
So if you have bones that show the age, so you were saying about that one skeleton that was living in chalklands, first of all, and then came into a maritime environment, how can you tell the age? I can understand how you could see the chemicals or isotopes in the bones, but how can you tell when that changes with an age?
You can tell if they come in during childhood because your teeth are still growing, and we know exactly when each bit of the crown. So one of your teeth, your crown might start growing at 1 year old, then 2, then 3, then at 5 the crown might be complete. Then the root starts growing, and because you take cross sections, we know what age we're taking those readings from. So that's the key, because we know how the dentition develops in a child, and so we can tell pretty much when they moved, if the signature changes at that particular cross section of the tooth.
So do you think he'd joined a sailing community or went to sea because of his diet becoming maritime? If he'd come to London?
I don't know why. It'd be guesswork, really. Sometimes you could think, we had one person who became a vegetarian, for example. I was thinking, did they join did they join the Charterhouse and become a Carthusian monk who don't eat meat, but you don't know for sure. So it's a bit of guesswork. But often you get people, if they move nearer to the coast, they have more marine in their diet. But it's difficult to be overly specific with these things. Yeah.
I was interested in the Parry fractures. Is it an English thing, and is it left and right-handed? Because obviously during the period in which you talked about, there was a longbow practice which would have put a lot of stress on the bones in the forearm, depending on which side they're holding the bow, and I imagine most people held it on one side. So if there was a Parry fractures more happening in England than in France, for example, you might be able to make that sort of conclusion.
Well, that's a good question, actually, because there are other studies of them, and for example, there are some from Nubia that they think are related to violence, where they've got Parry fractures. Also, we tend to get both males and females affected. In fact, females, as a proportion of the overall population, tend to be affected more often than males. And it's the left arm generally is more common. So
Why?
That's a good question. I don't know, but it does seem to be the left arm. I don't know why.
That's why I think it might be something to do with an activity.
Yeah. It could be. It's a mystery. So
Darkness comes behind your back.
Sorry.
When their arms bound, when you're left-handed or something, it's a connection. If the right hand was favoured or something.
I don't know. You do get, I mean, famously in the Mary Rose, you do get something called osteochromiale, where you get separation of the acromion of the scapula from the strain of the bow. It could be something to do with that.
Could it be more practical as a woman? You're quite likely to be holding a child in one hand, which would be your dominant or right hand. Therefore, your left hand, if you have to defend yourself.
Yeah, it could be. It's just strange that it practically disappears in the 19th century. By the 19th century, it seems to be a real medieval thing.
Do you think it's because women might have been beaten and they were sort of trying to protect themselves, and then by the 19th century, people were more civilized and so much? I don't know.
That's an interesting one, because you had different forms of assault, of course. punching wasn't so popular in the medieval period, I don't think. You tend to get far more evidence of people breaking their thumb from having their thumb outside when they punch someone, and broken noses, far more common in the 18th, 19th century. So, you know, maybe with your medieval stick, you were more likely to use that to hit someone than punch them. But I think there are theories that the forms of assault changed.
You would have had more weapons, wouldn't you? You know, daggers and knives, and it's still to be useful to fight against the enemies.
Yeah. Daggers are awkward because often they just go to the soft tissue and we can't see any evidence of it. So.
Sticks are better, you know,
Well, if you get a big axe, then yeah.
It's not about bones, but about the infrastructure that you talked about at the beginning of the deaths from the first plague. You know, what was the model for the lease? You know, did you pay to get buried? You know, it's, you know, we understand churchyards, associated parishes, and the burial ground. But, you know, how did they go about thinking we've got to put these really big infrastructure for burial in place?
That's a great question, because I talked about St Mary's Spittal earlier, and they had real issues. That burial ground, it started, I think, in the early 12th century at St Mary's Spittal. So that was preceding the Black Death. And it was a very large cemetery, 10,000 individuals in the end were buried there. And it was a priory hospital. So you'd think, oh, the patients would get buried there and the monks would get buried there. But actually what they did, because it's just outside the walls, the city used it as an overflow burial ground, and especially in times of famine. And they had a particularly severe series of famines in the mid 13th century, so 100 years before the Black Death. And they dug all these mass pits, and then they had to dig more mass pits. And they tried to dig the second phase of mass pits in between the first mass pits, and they started going through all these bodies basically that hadn't been buried very long. So it's a complete disaster. And my theory is that they learned from that. And when they saw the Black Death coming, they knew they had to open up new cemeteries at the Pardon Churchyard, at West Smithfield, at East Smithfield. They were far more prepared, I think. And you didn't have so many well, you probably did have a lot of mass pits, but not as many perhaps as you had at St Mary's Spittal, where there were hundreds of them. So yeah, it was perhaps people learning from past experiences.
But who was they? Was that the monastics or the city? You know, who was the governance?
Oh well, the king, ultimately. Say that Walter Manny, he was a courtier of the king. So and you'd have, I guess, the sheriff and other organisers in the town. But I don't know the exact, who was the actual person who agreed it. But I know that I think Walter Manny paid Bartholomew's for, I think it was 14 marks or something like that, for the lease of the ground, to use it for the Black Death burial ground.
And it's an emergency, so it's not like a churchyard or a cemetery in the later centuries where you literally
No,
paid.
you wouldn't have had to pay. No, you'd just be put in there. Yeah.
They didn't think of cremation.
No. I think the thing was, in those days, the actual body was still important, so they didn't want to corrupt the body. So they, I suppose, in a lot of Catholic countries, they have the same practice, and they wouldn't want to do that. But they used to do it in the Roman period, so why not? Yeah.
You showed a change in orientation.
Yes.
Do you know any reason why that happened?
There was a brook called the Faggotwell Brook that went just south of Charterhouse Square, where they found a lot of Tudor bits and pieces, and that went down to the Fleet River. But I think that brook was on a similar alignment to the first two phases of burial, so maybe they were buried using that. It may be that it was all a bit rushed and they just buried them as rough east-west as they could. It may be that there was some fence or some structure that meant they buried them in that orientation. Likewise, there may have been a later road or fence or structure that determined the later orientation of the third phase. So, yeah, one of those probably.
This isn't bone related either, but were there any other interesting archaeological findings at the Farringdon site or around Charterhouse Square?
Non-bone related. I don't know. Where's Nick?
So I think there was some small bits of medieval, perhaps even some Roman stuff, south of Charterhouse Square. If you can remember that weird shape that Don showed us on the map, the southern extremities, there were various bits and pieces we got down there. And we got what probably was the course of the Fagswell Brook that Don oriented, although only a 10-meter stretch of it. If you're really interested, the publication is available as a free download. If you go to MOLA's website, there'll be a link to a site where you can just download the report free, and any of the other Crossrail reports you might happen to be interested in.
I would like to ask one question, if I can borrow that. I think you're mic'd, actually.
I am.
Yeah. Just more generally about preservation, because there's something in my mind about, actually you've got a lot of bone in pretty good shape if you can do all that work with it. But broadly, the kind of world of forests and deep undergrowth and tribal peoples in those sort of circumstances versus desert. I think that you get better preservation of bones in certain climatic conditions. It would be interesting just to know what's been lost, what we can expect to find more, and where indeed this condition of London lies in that broader spectrum of thought about preservation.
Yes, there's quite a variable preservation. You can get variable preservation within a cemetery or even within a grave sometimes. But generally, London is quite good for skeletal preservation, particularly at sites we've had, post-medieval sites recently. And if you go to Sutton Hoo, places like that, where it's a more acidic sand, then you tend to get pretty much nothing surviving from the skeleton. It just eats it away. If you get a bog body, then quite often the bone again disintegrates, but you get the skin tanned, so you get survival and preservation of the skin. So there's quite a wide variation. In Egypt, you get natural mummification of individuals who are buried in the sand. It's very, very dry, so they tend to desiccate. So you get sometimes quite good preservation there of soft tissue and sometimes bone. So it's a really varied story. I don't know about forests because they're difficult to excavate, and I suppose we do have examples where we try and excavate near trees, for example, and all the roots have gone down, and it can be quite difficult, and the roots have sort of intertwined through the skeleton, and so it can be difficult to excavate and to interpret. But yeah, I think there's probably a lot of burials in areas of the world that are more forested now than they were. For example, in South America, where they find these cities in the middle of the jungle, then yeah, there's probably some burials there that you don't know that are there because they're covered in trees and may never be discovered. But yeah.
Any other burning questions? Otherwise, we can break up into more informal conversation around wine, cheese, and skeletons. So, thank you.